A fine pair of diamonds in a setting of gold. I had never heard the name Claude Diamond until I began to see it on the Franklin County Southern History Facebook page. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I've never heard of the name Diamond in Franklin County, but this gentleman seems to have quite a bit of knowledge. So I asked for permission to call him, and what a blessing I got when I met through the telephone Claude and Polly Diamond, presently of Georgia, but originally from Franklin County. Uh, Polly and Claude have, as my friend Mike would say, 11 dozen relatives in Franklin County. And Claude grew up on the log cabin road, what's now called the log cabin road. And I didn't realize there was ever a store on that road. And so he told me quite a bit about his grandmother's store, Miss Thomas Grocery. You'll see the sign in the pictures. And he lived not far from the gold hole. And he and Polly had a great picture that she had taken of the gold hole on one occasion, I think in the 50s. And so I found a true fine pair of diamonds in a setting of gold. They're a setting of gold in that they had knowledge of the gold hole, which we'll talk about either in this video or another one. But more importantly, they're a gold mine of wonderful information. I started to title this Diamond Like Moses because I was so blessed to hear Claude's story of how he came into his own at 65 and continued to live that life and still continues it today, although he considers himself no longer worthy of playing on stage. I think he sells himself way short. He is a tremendous musician. He only sings what he wrote. And I don't know that I've ever met anyone that has that distinction. And he's traveled over quite a bit of the world. And all of that started officially when he was 65. Now, he confessed to playing some honky tonks at an earlier age when he was playing over at the Wagon Wheel in Natchez, and I want to come back to that story in a minute, but also when he got out of Southern Miss, I believe that was around 55 or 6, if I recall what he told me, and he was playing some honky tonks there, and he came to the realization he could either be a family man or he could play his guitar in honky tonks, but he couldn't do both. And wisely and in a God honoring and a wife honoring and a children honoring way, he chose the right path. Tragically, the path much less traveled today. But he chose that path, and he taught, and he had some really interesting stories about where he taught and the blessings he had with that. But he taught for his whole career, and then when he retired, he was able to go back into the music business in a really powerful way and played with some tremendous, well-recognized musicians. But he traveled and sang his song. He did a whole album to help people with alcohol issues. And I've only been able to hear one of those songs, and I'm going to try to attach it to this story. It's just it's a wonderful song. And as a recovering alcoholic myself, it certainly spoke to me. But I think in a way, it's got a lot of message for all of us to hear. We'll hopefully come to that in this story. It's called The Highway of Life, I believe is the name of it. So this is Miss Thomas Grocery, and this is Miss Thomas. What an interesting story, isn't it? I wish I could see better the various items on the shelves. We can certainly see some things we recognize, drinks and colonial bread and bananas and canned goods. We see the scales up there. I got a kick out of Claude telling me, he said, this was before fast food. And I thought, yeah, I kind of figuring that. But what he followed with was funny and a blessing too. He said, of course, we had fast food. It just looked a little different. We had sardines in the can. We had potted meat. We had Vienna sausages. We had Coca-Colas. He said that's what most of the truck drivers that stopped in for a fast food lunch, that's what they ate. And so I hadn't thought about it like that. Claude and I were comparing notes about the gentleman, Steve Mock. I had made a comment to someone on the history Facebook page, Franklin County History Facebook page, that I had a couple of funny stories about Steve Mock, and Claude commented, he said, I know everything about Steve Mock. He said, I grew up. And so he told me, that Steve Mock, like most people, and he had a drinking problem, but he didn't start out that way. He was a fine gentleman with a good career and family, and has one son surviving him, Brandon. He told me that Brandon was that Steve was a little fellow, but Brandon is a great, big, stout man. He's quite old now, but he told me about Brandon coming to Roxy when they had like a traveling circus fair that came through, and Brandon wrestled the bear. They had a bear there to wrestle in downtown Roxy. I don't know how many of you have been to a bear wrestling match in Roxy before. I have to confess I haven't. But Brandon Mock, and this is all a part of that Sunnyside plantation. I'm sorry, I should have led in with that, which was just across the highway. Of course, the highway itself was much different back in the day that Claude is speaking of. It certainly wasn't 4-laned, and overhead bridge, for those of us whose teeth are long enough to remember this, was it was tall, but it was curving, and it had those white posts, and it came down in a curve, and then it went up by Sunnyside. On the right side, you had the turn to what we call Log Cabin Road that goes through to Hamburg on Highway 33. And so that's where Steve Mock and the whole Mock family and the Baker family and the various parts of that family lived across the highway over there, and beautiful home that they lived in for many years. But he told about Steve's son, Brandon, wrestling that bear. I didn't get a chance to tell him, but my Steve Mock story is that he came over to Meadville in response to a summons regarding his problem with alcohol. Someone had put him up to be committed, and he was sitting in the courtroom, and Judge Cottrell, I don't want to get too bogged down in that, but he was quite old and had been on the bench serving for many, many years. And Mr. Mock is sitting before him, and they were in the small courtroom that they use now as a board of supervisors room in the Franklin County Courthouse. And Mr. Mock was sitting in a chair, and the chairs were lined around the room, and he was seated just to the right of Mr. Frank Cowart. And Mr. Frank was his lawyer, and Mr. Mock had just sat down, and he hadn't seen Frank. And the judge said, Mr. Mock, I understand you have a problem with the Demon Rum. He said, well, that's true, Your Honor. And he said, "Are you represented by an attorney?" And he said, I am. I'm looking for him. He's supposed to be here this morning." And Daddy said he looked around the room one by one, nodding his head, looking at everybody. And when he got through with everybody else, he looked right beside him and he said, "Oh, there you are, big boy." And there was another story, but I want to get back to this fine pair of diamonds. So we want to listen to what Claude's song is about the highway of life. And I want to come back and do a whole nother story and talk some more about the store and the gold hole. But this is where we're going to pause right now and hopefully transition to Claude's one of his many wonderful songs. When you go in the door of the Wagon Wheel Honky Tonk on the east side of Natchez back in the day, they didn't ask you, were you armed, in order to disarm you. They asked you, were you armed, in order to provide you with a weapon if you didn't have one. Do you have a weapon? No. Would you prefer a knife or a gun? That's the story, and I've heard that from multiple sources, and Claude's Diamond verifies that. He says he liked using that in his discussions when he was playing the circuit, traveling around the world, telling about how he got his start. And so it was in the Wagon Wheel in the 50s that Claude Diamond was able to verify for me personally as an eyewitness what I had told in a separate story about a third cousin named Paul Whitehead, a blind pianist who played at the Wagon Wheel and who Jerry Lee Lewis said to his biography authorized author, I believe his name is Rick Bragg. He said, "I learned the basics of what I know of playing rock and roll from listening to and playing with Paul Whitehead, the blind pianist at the Wagon Wheel Honky Tonk in Natchez, Mississippi." And so Claude told me this wonderful story of he and Polly being there, and Claude was playing music and Paul was playing, and Claude knew Paul quite well. He said Jerry Lee was playing. He had one drum and one cymbal, and he was playing the drum with one hand, and he was playing the cymbal with a coat hanger. And he told Paul, he said, "That young man there is such a showman. We're going to hear something out of him one day." And I guess that was a pretty good, solid prediction, because certainly it's happened just exactly that way. So with nothing left to say but to hear what Claude has to sing for us, let's stand by now to hear Claude Diamond with The Highway of Life.